Okay, so we'll get going. So just want to say a big good morning. My name is Andrea. I'm from the Civil Service College. I'll be with you at the start of the session this morning with Rebecca Rothwell, who is delivering today's event on how to keep your reader reading. This is part of the professional development course that we deliver at the college. Rebecca does some courses around concise writing and so on, which we will touch on a little bit later on in the session. But I just want to say, if you do have any questions, if you want to share experiences, comments, if you've got any questions at all for Rebecca, please do feel free to use the chat box. That's what it's there for. We want maximum engagement, maximum participation. So please do use that chat box to ask questions throughout. Now, I just want to ask everyone kindly to keep your microphones off at all times. We don't want any background noise. Feel free, I mean, if you want to keep your cameras on, that's okay, but do turn them off if you feel comfortable with them off. That's absolutely fine as well. So again, maximum participation from everyone. Please use the chat box and we'll get going. So as mentioned, we are joined by the lovely Rebecca Rothwell, who is going to be delivering this session today for you on how to keep your reader reading. As mentioned, this is part of some of the professional development courses that we do deliver, but we'll touch on that a little bit later on. So Rebecca, I'd love to pass it on to you to take the session off. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Please continue in the chat to let us know where you're from. I'll try to adjust the content of the webinar according to who's here. So if you could let me know where you are. I'd also really love to know what you write as well, whether it's personally, whether it's professionally. What sort of things do you need to produce? Whether it's fiction, non-fiction, informative writing, articles, anything along those lines, anything that I could learn from in order to adapt what comes next in the webinar, that would be mightily useful. While you're doing that in the chat, and thank you so much, I can see things coming through already, which is great, thank you so much. A little bit about me. As Andrea said already, so I live in South Wales, in Newport, but courtesy of Zoom and Teams, we're able to deliver these sessions to anybody, it's just fantastic, really. So I run a company called Rothwell Editorial, which is a writing and an editing company. So I work with individuals and professional companies creating content, I suppose you could say, whether that's from scratch or whether it's adjusting content that's already been written. I've been doing that for around 12, 13 years now, and I really enjoy it. One of my favourite things to do, I think, is probably working with someone who's writing it themselves and helping them adjust, helping them learn what it is that can just tweak. What they can just tweak about their writing in order to make it more readable and more engaging for their audience. The last point there is just a little insight into me. I love language and linguistics and words. My dissertation in university was on the word penguin. I managed to get 15,000 words talking about one word. So it gives you an insight into the sort of thing that really gets me interested. The chat is fascinating. We've got article writers, we've got ministerial submissions, we've got staff messaging, so we've got internal communications, we've got external communications, we've got, oh, I just spotted Welsh Parliament there in Cardiff. Oh, fantastic, thank you, Catherine. You find brevity difficult? Yes, I think we all do. Absolutely a common theme coming here. And I'm so grateful for the effort you're putting into these. Editing science blogs, so that's interesting. We've got different topics coming through as well. While that's still buzzing away, Andrea, could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So depending on what you write will determine what your reader expects. it's not necessarily your job to entertain. It's not necessarily your job to keep your reader's attention. However, it can be, as you know. If I was a children's author, I would disagree with what I've just said. A children's author would need to contain that child's enthusiasm and imagination. However, if you're doing an internal communication, for example, with passing information on, then it's on the reader, I suppose, to keep going. But if we look at the wise words here of Margaret Atwood, who is probably best known for winning the Booker Prize 6 times, I think, and creating The Handmaid's Tale. If any of you studied English, you will have read it at some point. I think it's also been particularly popular on the TV adaptation as well. So her quote here reminds me constantly that there's so much merit in just writing. If we think about things too much, we can almost be paralyzed with worrying about being judged or getting it wrong. It happens to the best of us and the rest of us as well. So I always like to keep this quotation handy. If I waited for perfection, I would never write a word. There's always an opportunity to edit, especially if we're typing, if we're writing something and it's not necessarily an instant message. There's always scope just to go back and reflect on it. I love that quote. Thanks, Andrea. Could we move on to the next one, which is an editing quote? Because you can look at writing in 2 different ways. You can either write it once and be done with it, or you edit what you've written. So we'll find a balance of those 2 ways today. So we've looked at the written side. So this is Jodi Picoult, who's written 28 novels. I think she's topped the New York Times bestsellers list goodness knows how many times. So again, she knows a thing or two about a thing or two. Again, this leads on from Margaret Atwood's quote, that you can't get better at something unless you start. So it's always easier to edit, I think, than it is to write in the first place. And to edit a bad page is possible. You can't edit if you haven't already got started. So to go back to Margaret Atwood's quote, that idea of just get started is always better than worrying or spending too much time preparing, I think. So editing itself, so just to draw on this quote, it can come in many different ways. It can come from a friend reading what you've got, an opinion, a complete rewrite, change of tense, cutting down the word count. Every revision makes your piece of writing just that little bit stronger, regardless of your purpose, regardless of your audience. Thanks, Andrea. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So I don't have many slides at all. I think I've only got a couple more.
That's all right. We've got some fantastic comments in the chat box, though,
yeah,
from some participants. I don't know if you can see that. Copywriting on strategic content. So we've got more experience coming through. Journalism, people that work across government, different councils and so on. Can you see the chat box there, Rebecca?
Yeah, I
Content
can.
for proposition material to attract inward investment. Emails. So there's a whole bunch of different experiences in here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And there's also the feeling that I'm getting from people who have kindly attended the webinar today is that there's a clear idea of purpose, but also audience. And once you've established why you're writing and who you're writing for, you get to understand what you need to do as a writer to engage that particular reader. So I'm just taking Natasha's comments, presentations, courses and newsletters. So you can imagine that Natasha's responsible for communicating to a wide audience. So Natasha, I suspect you probably have to keep your messaging quite general in order to engage as many people as possible, to include as many people as possible and not to exclude. You've got so Kerry Peterson up in Shetland, using emails to promote training, and emails in particular. We have a particular style when it comes to emailing, but again, there's lots of personalization you can do if necessary, and those emails in particular, they might be quite sales focused in order to engage the reader, to entice them into a particular product as well. So lots of different styles can come through there. It's really interesting. Eddie Hewitt, absolutely fascinating. 100,000 words, brilliant. I'd love to read that one day. Thank you for letting us know. So this number 7, it appears in literature all the time. Apparently, our short-term memories can hold 7 bits of information easily. Again, apparently that's why telephone numbers are 7 digits long, because that's what we can remember. I'm not sure how true that is, especially in the days of mobile phones and not necessarily needing numbers anymore. But I've got 7 tips to keep your reader reading, and we can embellish each of those tips as much as possible. If you have any questions as we go through, or any comments, please put them in the chat. I can see the chat as it comes in live, and I'd love to make this next part of the webinar as engaging and as informative and as relevant to each of you as I possibly can. Just to go back to this number 7, apparently it is a prime number. It's got magical connotations. It crops up in literature all the time. Things are often listed in 7s, so that's why I've gone for 7 here, because I think you should be the intention is that you'll be able to retain and remember as many of them as possible. So let's go. Thanks, Andrea. And this is it really. These are the 7 top tips. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of them separately, and then perhaps we'll do like a summary at the end as well. But again, please, any engagement would be valuable as we go through. So I used to be a teacher before I went self-employed, working for Rothwell Editorial. I was a secondary school teacher, teaching English, which won't surprise you. And of all the points, I think this is the one where I might sound the most teacher-like. To write well, to engage your reader, you have to strip all ego from what you're writing. You need to take yourself out of what you're doing. You're writing for your reader, not for yourself. It's sort of the golden rule. And I found that through experience, not because I read it somewhere in a book, not because somebody told me, but that's what I've learned through my experience of being a writer and an editor and a teacher. That the reason you write is for somebody to read it, not to make yourself feel better. If you're writing for yourself, then your reader won't feel themselves in that text. We know already that all writing has a purpose, and some of the chats that have come through, I can really feel that those of you who've contributed, you really have a sense of purpose as to why you write, and who you're writing for as well. If the purpose of what you're writing is to transact, if it's to pass information over, then that's the time for few simple words. You don't need to overcomplicate something. If you're giving over a message, the fewer words and the fewer syllables, the better, because that will make it more memorable as well. Try to exchange difficult words for easier ones. So living in Wales, if I work for any public body in Wales, whether it's Sport Wales, Welsh Government, Public Health Wales, everything has to be bilingual. Everything has to be translated into Welsh. The more complex language I use, the more difficult it is for that translation to flow properly. And it might be that people on this call need to write in an English that can be easily translated, or perhaps the reader, your audience, isn't a native English speaker. So to bear that in mind, if you're writing for an audience whose first language isn't English, you will naturally write in a more straightforward, in a more simple way to get that message clear. It's more difficult, I think, to write in simpler words. We often lean on more complex words to cover a broader range of points. But the more simply you can write, the clearer your message will be. And if you can do that in fewer words, it takes skill and it takes practice, but it is worth it. I think it's harder to write simply because it's more exposing from the writer. You have to put more of yourself in it. It really tests your understanding of what you're trying to say as well. You can't hide behind difficult words. You have to use, by stripping back to simple words, you're really exposing yourself. Never underestimate the strength of a really simple statement. They're always the best ones, and they're the ones that resonate through history. They're the ones that resonate through time as well. Simple words, short phrases, it's more difficult, but it is worth the practice, I think, as it goes in. Patricia, that's a really interesting comment. Working in local government, it is hard to remove your ego, especially if it's just a transactional piece of writing. But then again, if you're presenting, you might well want to put some of yourself in there as well, because it makes it more natural to you. And that's an absolutely valid decision as well to take. Patricia, feel free to put a specific example in there if you're able to, and perhaps we can come to that as well. Thank you so much for adding that comment. Again, any questions that come through, I'll try my best to answer. If not now, then Andrea, perhaps at the end we can pick up any questions that I've missed maybe as we go through. Thank you so much. Imran, it's a really good question. Using simple words could mean that your sentences are longer. Complex words can shorten the sentence. Yes, I agree, but if you can do a combination of both of those, if you can have simple words, keeping your sentences fewer than, let's say between 10 and 15 words, then that's the real sweet spot. But I completely agree. Sometimes the choice to use complex words is better than using more simple words. I absolutely agree with what you've written there. Which actually, you're welcome, leads us on to the next point as well, about trying to keep your sentences short if you can and if it's appropriate as well. You'll remember from school that in English there is no right answer. There's no wrong answer either. If you can justify what you're doing, then you're probably doing the right thing. So if you leave today and you think, I listened to Rebecca, she talked about keeping my sentences clear, but in this case I really shouldn't, because as long as you can put a because in there, then I absolutely would hopefully do the same thing. I'd like to think that I'd make the right choices with you. If you're writing fiction, and I haven't seen anybody put in the chat that they do write fiction, that they're an author or a poet or a playwright or whichever, this may be because the comments that you put in the chat were your professional roles rather than your personal roles. But if you're just, bear with me, if you're writing fiction and you're writing a description, then that tends to be where you keep your longer sentences, because a longer sentence will slow down the pace of what you're writing, because your reader needs to slow down the speed that they're reading at in order to take in all of that information, especially if there's a lack of punctuation in there. If there's no comments or semicolons or brackets, If it's just words, then your reader will have to slow down the pace in order to take in what they're reading. So it's always worth bearing in mind that the longer your sentence, the slower your reader will read, and the longer it will take them to read as well. If you have shorter sentences, they naturally pick up the pace of what you're writing. And if your reader can trip along quite nicely, then that helps with engagement. It helps to keep them reading. A fair challenge to that would be where you could have a mix of short sentences and long sentences. And yes, you absolutely can, and you absolutely should, because it keeps your reader interested. If your reader is interested and they're engaged, then chances are they'll get to the end of what you've written and your job will be complete and they'll be satisfied as well. Thank you, Catherine. So looks like you need to, you're just asking for ideas on how you can make factual information more interesting. I'm more than happy to embellish on that, but if anybody else has got some tips for Catherine as well, if you can see the chat, if you've got access to the chat, then I'm sure your ideas will be far better than mine. Catherine, I will come to your question, but I might leave it into the format section, because it might be that you can have a play around with the style of what you're writing to enhance what you're saying. Rather than change what you're saying, you can, perhaps we can find some ideas as to how you're saying or how you're writing what you're writing. Some tips coming through already. Thank you. Patricia, thank you so much. You sometimes feel that you have to put a spin on things and to have a positive feeling to what you're writing. You tend to put your needs first and the reader second. Yeah, and I think someone's already like that. I think that echoes throughout many sectors. We represent the company who we're writing for, and you want to be able to say things with a positive spin. I think you're absolutely right, that can get in the way of what you're trying to write, because you have a responsibility to represent the company whom you're writing for as well. It's a really good point. It's a really interesting point. 2 likes already, and I'm sure you'll have more as that comes through. So the third point is description. Again, we've talked about how longer sentences tend to be describing. Stephen King, an American author, I read somewhere that he's one of the most prolific authors in terms of number of books bought, but also number of books written as well. I discovered the Mr. Mercedes trilogy right at the start of the pandemic, and I was captivated by it. Stephen King believes that the road to hell is paved with adverbs. So he tries to strip out all descriptive words unless they're absolutely necessary. So adverbs, they're the ones that tend to end in ly. So it'll be to run quickly or to breathe enthusiastically. Those words that end in ly, that tend to come after the verb, after the doing word. If you're a fan of Stephen King, then you may or you may not have noticed that he doesn't tend to use unnecessary descriptions unless he absolutely has to. Another example, and I know I'm leaning on literature here, so I don't know if anybody's a fan of the Hunger Games. So my daughter, who's 10, has just finished reading the 3rd book, and the descriptions in there, the author, I think, would gladly admit that she isn't a natural descriptor herself, but she tries to limit her adjectives and her adverbs because it just takes up too much space, there's too much time, and you can let your reader's imagination do that discovering for themselves. If you tell your reader too much, then they don't have to think for themselves. If you give them a little bit and let them continue, then they will remain just that little bit more engaged, especially with fiction. Oh, Fiona, I completely hear you on the point of legal language. you find, yes, me too, that legal teams are reluctant for information to be simplified. And often if you find that you're trying to work with legal language or with sporting language or with educational language, it can be very difficult to break through that that jargon, which we'll move on to shortly. I absolutely wish I studied law at university myself, and I think to be able to simplify legal language, once we've been able to do that, it would make things so much more accessible and friendly and more straightforward as well. The struggle is absolutely real. That echoes through my daily routine, I think. Thank you so much. Just to briefly go back to Stephen King and his quote that the road to hell is paved with adverbs. If you cut out words that aren't necessary, it may help your reader to keep reading, especially if it's an email, or especially if you're giving information over. I know people on this call are responsible for writing board papers and turning quite complex ideas into more concise quotations by removing adjectives, adverbs, so's, reallys, very's. You can really get down to the core of what you're trying to say, and it can be quite straightforward as well. Once you get the hang of it, you can spot those unnecessary words quite quickly. Thank you again for the chat. It's really interesting. Yeah, HR, Leanne, you're absolutely, yeah, you've got it nailed on there. And in fact, that leads us quite neatly on to the next point, which is jargon. So jargon is that sort of tribal language, if you like. I think Susie Dent, who's a bit of a word guru, has a book out on tribal language, and she means that language that's peculiar to a particular company or a particular sector, or teenagers, if you have teenagers in your household. So one of my roles is I work for Sport Wales. And if I was writing an internal email to a colleague, I might use phrases such as NGB, CEO, investment model, CLIP, performance sports, WADA, UCAD, IOC, all utter nonsense to somebody who's not really within that sphere of sport. Again, internally, jargon can be absolutely brilliant. It can be a time saver. It can connect you with your colleagues because you've got this code between each other. You can talk more quickly, you can write more quickly, you can read more quickly. It's only when you start projecting out to a wider audience that you might just need to reflect on the jargon that's in your writing to ensure that you're not excluding any of your readers. The moment a reader feels excluded, you've lost them. And I suppose it must be a fine balance between understanding, or between knowing what you can get away with an external reader and what you need to revise quite carefully so that they feel a part of what you're saying as well. Alison, you're in the NHS and you're awash with jargon and acronyms. Yeah, I bet you absolutely are. There's sort of urban myths, aren't there, about doctor's notes and acronyms that are used there. But again, I'm sure lots of it is down to speed. There are the same acronyms across different sectors. So if you work in the sports sector for a few years and move across to the NHS, I've got a feeling that there are some acronyms that mean totally different things, and it's getting used to that way of talking. Algebra started out as a secret code with mathematicians to specifically to exclude people who weren't au fait with mathematics. It created bonds, it created friendships, it created a secret code. And so now when my children are learning algebra, I love that. I love to impart that knowledge onto them, that algebra used to be the secret code of mathematicians that you can only break once you're part of that inner circle. And it makes you good. It makes you feel good to be part of something along those lines. Oh, there's a comment here that I just want to refer back to. Say, Eddie, enjoying short words, but writing creatively and celebrate words with creative nonfiction. Yeah, so creative nonfiction, like if you can get away with putting yourself, even just slightly, into some nonfiction, into some factual writing, then I think you should absolutely go for it. I really enjoy playing with words. I really enjoy adding just the tiniest bit of me into an email. It is a bit self-indulgent, but if I've got the time and if I know who I'm writing to, and if it tells my reader a little bit more about what I'm trying to say, then I do enjoy doing that. And it's good to see that you're doing the same, Eddie. Thank you so much. Is there anything else on jargon that I wanted to say? And feel free to put in the chat any jargon that you use in your jobs that would baffle the rest of us. We can all see if we can figure out what you're trying to say with the language that to your internal colleagues would probably make absolute perfect sense, but to anybody from the outside it would just be an absolute mystery. I mean, I've put there avoid jargon. I suppose that's true, but in an internal email, if you're bonding with somebody, if you want to impress upon somebody that you understand the sector that you're working in and that, you know, the current project that you're working on, then it's probably something that you want to embrace rather than avoid. Oh, Carol, thank you so much. So yeah, EDI, that seems to be the acronym that a lot of companies are using, but in that order as well, because if you were to rearrange EDI, you could get DIE, which isn't necessarily what you'd want. And I don't know if equality is more important than diversity, which is why it comes first. I think it's really interesting because you could also get EID from that as well. And I think EDI, it seems to be quite the buzz acronym at the moment, and the more it spreads, the more acceptable it will be to use. Yes, Carol, I think you've summed it up beautifully. The different audiences will assume different interpretations as well. So at Sport Wales we use EDI, but we have ED, and then we have the ampersand for and then I. The ampersand, there's that symbol for and or die, yes, actually means equal on both sides. If you have ED and I, it would suggest that the I is slightly less important than the ED. But if you have ED ampersand I, everything is equal on either side. Think Marks and Spencer. So it's not Marks AND Spencer, it's Marks ampersand Spencer. It's because when Mr. Marks and Mr. Spencer first got together and created the shop, they were both equal partners in that. It's always worth having them. I think B&Q as well has got the ampersand in between. It's the slightest difference, but it can resonate with some people. Fiona, we use WTF for Walton Town Council. Always makes you chuckle. Yeah, it would make me chuckle as well. Thank you for sharing that. That's really great. Thank you. So just to come back to the point about transactional information, but how you can't change what you're saying, you can change how you're saying it. So you can look at font. So font is how you write something, and the vast majority of what I write is typed, is word processed, and I do make a conscious choice as to what font, what size, and what style of writing I choose as well. I think my Outlook is set to, is it Calibri body, light, size 11. That wasn't the standard. It's one that I chose because I wanted to make my writing to look as clear as possible. If you've pop in the chat if there's a font or a font size that you tend to change to, especially when you're writing for a specific purpose. Let me know in the chat, let us know in the chat, because I'll be really interested to know what you favour and if you can say why as well. So you've got the sans fonts as well, and they're the ones without the flourishes. I think sans literally means without in French. So any font that has sans, it just keeps the letters more distinct and more clear as well. Catherine has Arial 12, Arial 13 is a council standard. Again, consider why that's the standard for the council. If you use a more complex text, it can have different connotations for your audience as well. Standard font in A for positive, sorry. Yeah, Arial, okay. Corporate guidelines, yeah. On it 12 for equality purposes, yeah, absolutely. Again, if you were writing something spooky, you might go for a slightly different font around Halloween. I don't know, have a little bit of fun if you can. But if you are limited, if you are restricted with the star because of corporate communications, interesting to know why that particular font, I wonder. Deviate from Segoyo. Okay, oh, that's interesting. Arial to Homer, yeah, better accessibility, yeah, absolutely. Size 14, okay, so there's a difference in sizes with those. I tend to use, so my Rothwell editorial account is on Gmail, and that's that's different to my Outlook. It's interesting how there are different ones there. Yeah, okay, well, that's really interesting. So if you are able to change the font in what you're doing, then it might be worth it. But by the looks of it, you've got the restrictions of the company. Gin, everybody matches gin. Thanks, Alison. I think you've got the I suppose the strictest advice on font is to stay far away from Comic Sans, that one that's favoured by primary school teachers, but just seems to strike horror into the face of any signs that are written in that font. Calibri, yeah, same here, Carol. I enjoy that one. Catherine, yeah, find out. I'd be really interested now, especially as I don't know if you're just down the road from me, but the Senate is certainly just down the road from me. It would have been an informed choice as well as to why that particular font was used. And so they tend to be those fonts that are clear without those flourishes at the end of letters, to strip out the ego, to strip out the personality from them, and for accessibility as well. Yeah, Calibri Light, thanks Tracy. Kindred Soul there for informal emails. Interesting how you have a different choice for that. It's good that you're able to have that informed decision in there. Who knew that we could spend 6 minutes of a webinar talking about fonts? Thank you so much for your engagement. Comic Sans, I wouldn't use it either, David. I feel like it's getting a bit of a reputation for itself, but I think it does seem to be quite a child-friendly font at the same time. So maybe I'm a bit of a fence bender when it comes to that. Thank you so much. Again, more than words is formatting your text, so how it looks on the page. So ignoring what's actually written at the moment and just looking at the style of how it's written, whether you have short paragraphs or long paragraphs, whether you have bullet points, margins, colour, italics, images in what you're writing, that can all enhance what you're trying to say and how you're trying to say it, and can guide your reader around the place. So again, with Sport Wales, because everything in Wales, everything that a public, if you're funded by the Welsh Government, you have a legal obligation to send out all of your communications bilingually, or ask what your reader would prefer, and if they prefer it in Welsh, then it has to go in Welsh, or it has to go in English, whatever the preference is. At Sport Wales, we will have, if we send out a communication, it will be on a split screen, and you'll have the one hand column will be in English and the other hand column will be in Welsh. We've chosen to do it that way because if we had English first and then the Welsh, chances are people wouldn't read to the bottom of the English and then read exactly the same thing in Welsh. They'd only read the English. You'll also see in Wales as well that signs will be written Welsh first. That's the preference, rather than English first, because if you have the English first, you won't tend to read to the end, whereas if you have Welsh first, even if you're not a Welsh speaker, you have to read through the Welsh to get through to the English. So at Sport Wales, we do it concurrently in 2 columns, and that's a conscious choice that's been made because of the bilingualism in the country. If you don't need to produce something bilingual, but you need to direct your reader to a particular point, then you'll know already that you've got headings, tables, images you can use. Even moving text now can be added quite easily. It doesn't need to be black font on a white page either. You can use shapes, sizes, colours, anything to enhance what you're saying, even if it's a simple bold or underline. Whatever the template is, it can just help your reader. It can also guide your reader. They might not need to read everything that's on the page. There might just be specifics on there that you want to highlight, that you want to pull out. Again, that can help keep your reader reading. It can help keep them engaged, because they only need to read what they need to read, rather than having to go through everything that's on that page. Eddie, a really interesting point. The increasingly prominent issue of not offending people through one's writing. I mean, you'll know already that there's only so much you can do as a writer. There's responsibility on both parts, I think, to interpret in some ways. I think we do have responsibility not to be inflammatory. Again, it depends on the purpose. It depends on your audience. It depends why you're writing. That brings us on to the next and final tip, I suppose, of keeping your reader reading. I retweeted this morning, actually, a few hours ago, News Round. So whether we have international people on this webinar, so CBBC is the children's BBC channel, and News Round create really quite incredible articles for children to read themselves, or for parents to read and then communicate with children, or teachers to their children. And Eddie, if you look on Twitter or on the News Round site, the articles that are written for children avoid energetic language, lively language. There's a lot on the war in Ukraine, and there's some really beautifully crafted articles on the News Round website, written specifically for children. There's no politics in there. The words are simple, they're straightforward. Paragraphing is really clear, and the simplicity of the language defies almost the message that News Round are wanting to get to children. So it's informative and it explains, but it explains really gently and really carefully. And I've never come across a News Round article, or even really something that's on CBBC, that could satisfactorily be accused of offending anybody, because it's so careful in what it writes, because it has a broad audience, because you're talking to a group of people who might be frightened, they might be nervous, they might be worried. But the language and the way that those articles are written, I couldn't recommend more highly. I think whoever crafts them, works on them, edits them, it's really quite something. So I felt so strongly this morning on one of the articles that I read about, I think it was Ukrainian refugees, that I felt so strongly about it that I retweeted it, and I explained in my tweet why I felt it was a really good article. In my humble opinion, I think all articles should be written in child-friendly language so that everybody has access to it. You're welcome, Eddie. And please feel free to continue the conversation with me as well. I'd love to know how you get on with that. I think, the only other thing I wanted to say about that last point about write as if you're writing for a child is that you're looking for about the reading age of a 10 to 12-year-old. If what you're writing can be read and understood by a child just going to secondary school, then you've probably done a brilliant job. If it's too complex, if it's too complicated for a year 7, a year 8 pupil to read, then you might want to just have a check and just make sure that it's supposed to be that complex or it's supposed to be that complicated. David, thank you. Yes, Radio 1 News, I think you're absolutely right, and that might well be to do with their audience as well. It's a younger audience, an audience that might not necessarily have the historical knowledge of what's going on. So yeah, I completely agree. Actually, Radio 1 News is a good one. Thank you. I'm really grateful that you put that in the chat. My favourite author, and I think he'll always be my favourite author, which is quite a bold statement, is Ernest Hemingway. So if you ever wanted to see any of these tips in practice, in longer prose, I'd recommend The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. It just articulates everything that I'd like to share with you in the webinar today. Also the news round site as well. And that they're both really accessible and worth your time having a look at. David, that's really useful. Thank you. What was 15-year-old daughter? Who was that? Chris. Anything that's not should have passed it. Yeah, it's a good idea. It's a good idea if you can pass it to somebody else to read, especially a younger reader, and if they can understand it, then you're probably good to go. I'm really grateful for the interaction that's here. Thank you so much. David, that's a really useful link as well. Thank you. That's really helpful. Andrea, so I think, so that sort of rounds off those 7 top tips that I was really keen to share with everybody here today. I hope I haven't, but I probably have. If I've missed elements in the chat, then I'm ever so sorry, and I'd love to go back and just have a look through and just make sure I haven't missed anything significant.
That's fine. Yeah, you can just have a little look in the web chat. If you do have any questions at all, whether it's a really simple question or a difficult question, I'm sure Rebecca will be happy to answer those. It might be something on an article that you're writing, you know, a personal piece, a report, whatever it is, big or small. I'm sure Rebecca would be well, she will be here to answer those questions, so feel free to just pop them in the chat box. Rebecca, whilst you do look through the chat box, I'm just going to quickly mention some of the course dates that Rebecca's actually delivering for us this year. This is just a small, very small chunk of what Rebecca you know, will cover. She does lots of amazing things, but the dates that she's got for the concise writing courses with the Civil Service College, we've got one coming up on the 6th of May, another on the 5th of September, and another date on the 24th of November. And you know, Rebecca, you go into a hell of a lot of stuff. Do you want to just give us some, give the viewers some information about what you do cover and what's to be expected?
Yeah, for sure. So I go to great pains to get to know who's going to be, and I know that the Civil Service College does this regularly and as a matter of fact anyway, but to know who's coming to the course is so helpful because the course content is designed to be agile. It's designed to work around who's coming on the day. And I suppose similarly to today's webinar, I wanted to give you a flavour that I like to divide it between editing and writing. A full day on concise writing, it is more fun than it sounds, I absolutely promise you. A good chunk of that time is spent away from the screen, actually crafting something or writing something or returning to a piece of writing to edit it. And then if individuals are able to, we can then look at that together. Sometimes though the content of what people are writing, they're not able to share, but we seem to be able to work around that to talk about things at a slightly higher level to ensure that by the end of the day, everybody leaves with some practical advancement that they didn't have at the start of the day. It's really important to me that practical lived experiences can happen throughout the course of the day. I really enjoy learning about who's on the call, finding out stories, finding out the specifics of what each individual needs to do. And what's great about the Civil Service College's courses is that they're limited to, I believe it's 12 people, Andrea, isn't it? So you can really get to know who's on the call and ensure that every person benefits personally from the content of the course.
Fantastic. So any information about the course, that we have the details on the screen. I know there's a few questions that have came on there, so if you just want to send an email to us, or you can actually contact myself, I'll put my contact details in the chat box very, very shortly. We would be more than happy to have that conversation with you, whether it's for yourself or we do an in-house version as well, or whether it's just for your organisation. That's absolutely fine. So I'm just going to put my email in there as well.
While you're doing that, Andrea, Gary, thank you for your message. You talk about how no matter how much work you put in to crafting a particular piece of writing, because of the processes that it has to go through, by the end of that process, it's almost unrecognisable as to the quality of the writing that you put into it. Any help I can give, gosh, other than to challenge the process, or to perhaps, I don't know if you're able to keep some sort of hold on the style, on the content of what ends up on the minister's desk at the end of it. It's really difficult. It might be more of a cultural shift, perhaps. I suppose offering to proofread the final version might be one of the solutions. It shouldn't take very long to proofread something that's been through a few iterations. It might just be a suggestion, perhaps, to perhaps to take back a little bit of control of to what's written there. I can't be of more help than that. I wish you could take the bull by the horns on that one. Andrea, can I just run through another couple of these? Is that okay with you?
Yeah, God, yeah, we've got time. That's fine. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Stuart. You've put the storytelling approach to writing content. So I completely embrace the approach that stories are everything. And in fact, I often tell people that I'm a storyteller rather than a writer, because I think there's always a story to be found, and there's always a story to be told as well. I completely agree that it's a way of engaging your reader as well. The traditional sort of shape of a story, if you like, and I think it started with Aristotle, is you start sort of here with just an introduction, and then something happens, and then a complication occurs, and then there's a sort of climax of the story, and then there's a resolution, and then there's a conclusion towards the end. So you've got this sort of arc of the story, and if you can add that storytelling element to a piece of writing, then I think your reader will be engaged, but they might not realise why they're engaged. But it's because you've employed those storytelling devices with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I completely agree that it's a great way of engaging your audience. Thank you. David, yeah, letting bad habits go, it's a tough lesson to learn, but thank you for returning to that one. Gary, you're very welcome. Sarah, you talk about analogies helping to pull people into less well-known topics. I think they can be really helpful in the same way that images can be really helpful to apply the skeleton, if you like, of what you're trying to say to another situation, especially if it's a current situation, especially if it's currently in the news, or if it's a buzz topic at the moment. I think it's a really good idea. David, yeah, I think I would echo everything you've put there about guidance for writing for ministers. I think sometimes writing skills can be overlooked in place of more fancy things, but I think coming back to those really straightforward elemental writing skills. I think a lot could be better for that. I completely feel your frustration there. Thank you for sharing that. Thanks, Andrea.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, again, if you've got any last remaining comments or questions for Rebecca, please do put them in the chat box. But just to give you a little bit of information on the webinars that are coming up, we've actually got another webinar this week with Kat Thorne on positive habits for a happier workplace. So that'll take place at the same time, 10:30, apologies, on the 2nd of March. We also are running an event for International Women's Day 2022, which is Break Biases to Lead Differently, a new era of leadership. And that is with Anaxi Mystery and a panel of guests. We've got 3 guest speakers on that, and that'll take place next week on International Women's Day itself. And the next one after that will be on the 22nd of March, Making the Most of Midlife Talent, Keep Great People and Become an Employer of Choice, and that is with Katie Day and Dr. Roger Prentice. If you are interested in signing up for those webinars, they are completely free. Just simply go onto our website. You'll see that there's a webinar page on there, and you can simply sign up for the free webinar that way, or you can contact me. I've put my email address in the chat box as well if you have any questions about the webinars that we do run. So yeah, I guess that is it from us. Thank you so much for your time, Rebecca. You've been fantastic, and we've had some amazing feedback in the chat box, and the messages are still coming through there, so feel free to read through those, Rebecca. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please do stay connected, find out about the webinars that we're running, any projects that we're doing, courses, workshops and so on. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and this recording will be sent to everyone via email, but it will be put on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been great.
Absolute pleasure. I'm really, really grateful to see everybody here. Thank you so much, and thank you for the engagement as well. I've learned a lot today, so thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and yeah, we'll hope to see you all very soon. See you later. Bye.